Welcome everybody to the Marxist School of Sacramento. We are still going strong, having begun this popular education project in May of the year 2000. It is now September of 2015.
We've got an exercise for the audience to fill in the current. Make sure everyone's awake.
Yes, everyone's awake. Tonight we're very pleased to have as our speaker Diana Block. She's the author of this novel, Clandestine Occupations, An Imaginary History. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area and will speak tonight about her novel, which is based on the lived experiences of women such as herself who lived underground during the revolutionary, radical, and counter-revolutionary 1960s and 1970s. So without any further ado, turn the night over to Diana Block. Let's give her a welcome.
Thank you. Okay. All right, so if you can't, I think you can hear me. I hope it's not too echoey. So first, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. As I was telling people a little while ago, this is the grand kickoff of my new book, and it just arrived in our hot little hands this morning, literally, the new so since I haven't seen it before now, I mean, of course I've seen it, but not in flesh and blood, I will be reading from the galleys rather than the book itself, but they are the same. So yeah, I'm really glad to be able to speak with you about the book and about everything, my history and whatever you're interested in. And I think in general I really like back and forth participation, so that's, I hope, when your questions, think of your questions, save the questions. I really would like to be able to address them. So this book grew out of the process of my writing a memoir, and the memoir was published a number of years ago. It's called Arm the Spirit, A Woman's Journey Underground and Back. And in the memoir, I actually talked about my history going underground in the early 1980s, developing out of a radical political organization, and then talked about the whole process, having children underground, and eventually coming back to the Bay Area, where I have lived since 1995 now. So after I wrote the memoir, which was, of course, a big project, I realized that there were a lot of other stories I had to tell that hadn't been fit into the framework of the memoir, and I really wanted to develop them. So that was one motivating factor for writing the novel. Another aspect was that when you write a memoir, you have to be very aware of the other people that you're writing about or that you're talking about, because you don't want to, especially when you're talking about sensitive political history, so you don't want to violate certain aspects of security or confidentiality, privacy. And so that was another thing. I felt like if I developed fiction, some of those barriers, some of those constraints wouldn't any longer be weighing down on me. Another factor was that I wanted to make it more accessible to more people. I mean, the memoir it's a step beyond just history, because it's obviously has personal and political strands, but I put a lot of political theory and stuff into the memoir, so I wanted to see, and some of it was a challenge for myself as well as in writing, whether I could figure out how to write a book that could get my history and the history of a whole segment of radical politics out to more people. So that was another factor. And finally, I just wanted to have the creative leeway and ability to just write the story. So those were some of the major motivating factors that led to this book, which it has a lot of the material or it starts with my experience, and that's something I really want to make clear, because it really isn't the same story as just my history. It starts with my experience, but it really tries to see my experience from the point of view of other people. And I thought that was really important, because I intersected for so many years with people underground and above ground, who we would cross paths, and we would have some similarities of something, but really we didn't see the world in the same way. And I really thought that in order to explicate this history in a more rounded way, trying to tell the story from the points of view of some of these other women would be a very good way to do that. And so that's what I have tried to do in the novel, is I've tried to take on the points of view of other people that would have seen me and my activities and my political perspective in a very different light than the one I was coming to. So before I will start with an excerpt from the first chapter, I do also want to say that when I started this book, it took a number of years. I mean, I have a full-time job. I also do political work. I'm a founding member of the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, which is now celebrating its 20th year. And it took a while to fit in writing this novel. When I started writing it, it was actually I feel like a different political time than the one we're in now. I know things may not seem like they're totally transformed, but the phrase mass incarceration wasn't even being used. I mean, really, I've been doing this work for 20 years around prisons, and it's only in the past few years that phrase has gained currency. The new Jim Crow is another phrase that has really just recently come into popular expression. And then, of course, more recently, over the past year, a little over a year, the issue of police violence, the Black Lives Matter, all that has also burst onto the national discourse around policing, prisons, and things that this novel is actually about. As I said, it starts with my history underground, but a lot of it goes into other aspects, and it even goes into the future, because that was something I really wanted to try and project, with some mini vision of what things could be like in 2020. So that's my preface, the intro. Now I'm going to start to read. The first chapter is called Missing, and it's also subtitled Belinda, who is the woman who is speaking. and the time point from which it's told is 1986. At first I wasn't worried when Lynn disappeared from my life. She had disappeared before and returned. It was August in Los Angeles, and all the people who can get away pack their bags. If I could, I too would escape from the broken backs, the torn meniscuses, and the arrogant doctors of the ortho ward at Arcadia Memorial, where I put in my mind-numbing 60-hour weeks. I figured Lynn must have gone to visit her family with her new baby. I wouldn't have given it a second thought if it weren't for the envelope hidden in my basement that I had promised to safeguard for her. Lynn had called me right after her baby was born in the beginning of August. I knew that he was born on August 2nd, that her labor was 5 hours long, and that the baby's name was Alex. Alex is my favorite uncle, she explained, even though I hadn't asked about the origins of his name. I bit my tongue and didn't say, if Uncle Alex is such a favorite, why haven't you ever mentioned him to me before? Which was what I was thinking. With most people, I didn't give a shit and just said what was on my mind. But I had come to be more careful with Lynn. She deserved that consideration. Lynn liked that I was blunt. About a week after she started working evenings as a unit clerk on the ortho ward, she came up to me as I was doing my charts. I heard what you said to that doctor, she began in her serious, husky voice. Already eavesdropping on confidential nurse-doctor conversations, I kidded, not sure where she was coming from, but she wasn't put off. Dr. Stanwyck was accusing that elderly black patient who just had back surgery of manipulative behavior because he wanted more pain meds. I interrupted her. Oh yes, young Dr. Stanwyck just finished med school and he thinks he's the supreme authority on pain and manipulation. But sweetie, that's my specialty. So I told him that poor Mr. Williams needs his meds or he isn't going to be able to heal correctly. I stopped myself before I turned it into a rant. Weren't you worried you'd get in trouble telling a doctor that you knew better than he did? Oh, it's okay. If they fire me, I'll just go back to being a waitress. Almost as much money and less stress. Lynn laughed, and when she did, her mouth relaxed and she stopped being such a super solemn chick. It made me want to get to know her, even though it was against my rules to get too friendly with anyone at work. So, believe it or not, Belinda goes against her rules and does try and get to know Lynn better. And so the next section, I skip some and then get into this next section where she invites Lynn over to listen to her jazz collection, which sounds like maybe an old line, but it worked on Lynn. And so Lynn comes over and meets Belinda and Belinda's 5 dogs. And they're chatting, and Lynn and Belinda tells her the names of the dogs, and one of the dogs' names is Consuela, and the others are all Irish names. So Lynn asks her, well, why did you name her Consuela? And Belinda says, well, it's for my Puerto Rican grandmother. And Lynn is very surprised because she doesn't realize that Belinda is Puerto Rican because she looks very Irish, and it turns out she has a Puerto Rican father and an Irish mother. So this segment comes after that. That's kind of the framework. So then they go and they start listening to the jazz records. They smoke a couple of joints. They get a little stoned. And Lynn asks Belinda, did you ever meet your grandmother, Consuela? No, but my father would show me pictures of her and the house where he grew up in some village in PR. He would point to the flag that was flying on top of the house and say, "That's my bandera, not the fucking stars and stripes, our Puerto Rican bonita bandera." I hadn't thought about any of this for so long. I couldn't believe it was coming out of my mouth now. Was he an independentista? Lynn asked. That stopped me. Of course I knew the word, someone who wanted Puerto Rico to be independent. I had done a paper on the independence movement for some class in college, and learning all that stuff I never knew about Puerto Rico blew my mind. When Lynn said the word independentista, a picture immediately popped into my head of Lolita Lebrón being arrested in Washington, D.C. I had spent hours staring at the photo while I was supposed to be doing my report. She was fiercely beautiful, even in that terrible moment, wearing a tailored suit and pillbox hat. I couldn't believe that she and 3 Puerto Rican men had gone into Congress, unfurled a Puerto Rican flag, and started to shout and shoot at the assembled lawmakers. It was totally incongruous that this impeccable lady had just stood up in front of all those old white men and interrupted their tea party. But that was the point. No one saw it coming. Those crazy independentistas were able to get the white guys to stop whatever bullshit they were talking about. They made the world pay attention, if only for a few minutes, to the fact that Puerto Ricans didn't want the U.S. to keep controlling their land, their water, the air they breathed. They didn't want to be a fucking U.S. colony anymore. Even with policemen on both sides of her, grabbing her arms, even when she knew she was going to prison, Lolita looked cool and unflinching in the picture. I kept looking at the picture to try and solve the puzzle, but somehow I never could. Lolita was beautiful and brave, but she was loca. I could understand being that angry, but I couldn't wrap my mind around risking my life for some ideal like independence, especially when she must have known damn well that shooting up Congress may be a showstopper, but it wasn't really going to make Puerto Rico be free. But Lynn probably had a different take on the whole situation. She pronounced the word independentista like she was used to saying it. Like for her and her friends, it meant something familiar and real instead of some foreign fantasy concept. She made me realize how little I really understood about Puerto Rico, and I started feeling mad all over again. Well, my father always talked about how fucked up the Yankees were, but he moved here, married a drunken Irish Yankee, and only talked about how cool freedom was when he was full of booze. He sure as shit got his own freedom when he left us, walked out after one of their endless drunken brawls, and he didn't come back to give us history lessons when we got older. But it sounds like you know much more than I do about Puerto Rico and independence, probably from all of your independentista friends. As soon as I said it, I wanted to take it all back. Lynn was looking disoriented and her teeth were rubbing across her lips. "You're putting words in my mouth," she protested. "I didn't mean it that way," I mumbled, but I couldn't find the words for anything more. The music had ended and the needle was scratching purposelessly back and forth. We were on the verge of sinking into terminal disconnection when I heard the sound of the dogs barking happily outside. "Do you want to meet my babies?" I asked, grasping at straws. And to my relief, Lynn said, "Sure." So that's the setup for the chapter and what happens between Lynn and Belinda. And, I was having an interesting conversation a little before this started about Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican independence movement and how, in fact, in this point of time, Puerto Rico has begun to make front-page headlines again, not because anyone's shooting up Congress, but because there is this enormous, insoluble debt on the level of what the Greeks are facing, and there's no solution. because Puerto Rico has no economy left, and everything has been taken, basically. And the reality of the colonial reality is there, but it has been clandestinely concealed or for many years. So that's happening now, and I feel like there is more public attention to the issue of Puerto Rico that then can shed light in the present on some of these the ways in which we all were committed to the struggle for Puerto Rican independence back in the 70s and the 80s. So I think there's a good synergy in that way about it. But this is one of my stopping points, since I've put out a lot of stuff about Puerto Rico, why I wrote the book, etc. So I don't know if people have questions. I mean, I have more that I had to read, but I think maybe if you have questions about this part, it would be great. Yeah?
One thing that's kind of interesting is timing, 1984, to go underground. That's kind of a real interesting time. I mean, well after all the social movements of the 60s and stuff like that. Generally people went underground in the late 60s and early to mid 70s. What spurred that?
Right. So that is the popular conception, even though it's not entirely true. I mean, it's definitely true. There was a high point of people going underground. First, the Weather Underground, well, not first, but the Weather Underground being one of the most famous or notable organizations in the late 60s and through the 70s. Then there were several other groups that went in the 70s, Black Liberation Army. In fact, in the timing of the book is a little different from my actual history. We went underground in 1981, and that was a high point of the Puerto Rican clandestine movement. There was an organization called Los Macheteros, who were doing a lot of actions on the islands themselves. There was another organization called the FALN that was doing actions in New York and Chicago. They were all with the purpose of really demanding independence or raising the issue of independence for Puerto Rico. And they saw their struggle in the context of other liberation struggles, which, while many of them began in the 60s and 70s, were only coming to fruition in the late 70s and 80s, like Nicaragua, El Salvador. I mean, these were struggles that were going on in the 80s, and Puerto Rico, as a Latino nation or colony, whichever you care to see it, saw itself, the Puerto Ricans who were part of the independence movement. Obviously, that's not all Puerto Ricans, but my collective was acting in solidarity with those groups that were, in fact, doing these types of actions. In 1983, there was the largest, I think, political bank expropriation that ever had occurred in U.S. history, from the Wells Fargo Bank in Hartford, Connecticut, which was done by Puerto Ricans, Los Macheteros. I mean, these are pieces of history which I guess, they, depending upon who you are and what you want to think about, they could remain hidden forever. But they happened, and no one really is aware of them anymore. And they did frame important, political debates, political discussion in that era. That at the same time that there was a lot of activity, there was also a lot of political repression. So many of the people, not surprisingly, who were involved in these different activities ended up in prison. And so there came to be, by the mid-1980s, there were about, about 15 to 20 Puerto Rican political prisoners. And they remained in prison, most of them, until 1999, when President Clinton commuted the sentences of 11 of them. So that too is possibly little known, but definitely true history. There is one political prisoner, Puerto Rican, from that era, who was arrested in 1982 or 1983, Oscar Lopez Rivera, who is still in prison. And there is a big international campaign that's going on now about him in order to free him after all these years. I mean, he's been in since 1983. But, you know, the funny thing, I mean, I have worked a lot around political prisoners and other prisoners for years. And it's like the best kept secret. I mean, things that are true just don't get out in the media. They don't even get out in the left media. And so all of these strands of political history are kind of lost to many of us. I mean, I've been working for the past number of years around the case of the Cuban Five. Do people know who they are? Yeah. And probably part of it, I mean, I'm not saying everyone, but is because they were just finally released in a very public and agreement last December. But until then, most people, even on the left, had not heard about the Cuban Five because they received so little coverage and so little mainstream attention. So it wasn't until they actually were released as part of the move towards political relations with Cuba, and part of the, you know, that was the bottom line of the Cubans. They would not move towards normalization of relations unless the Cuban Five were released. And so they were. But, of course, that's not how the U.S. media spins it. They kind of emphasize the ways in which they had the upper hand, and they got an American spy back, and which is all that's true. But the background is sort of different. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. The 1980s were not a high point, however, of general American movement activism. Reagan had come into power. He was launching his grand scheme to change everything. So it wasn't the most logical time, and yet we did it. So, and of course, you know, we could all question, I mean, whether that was the most sensible thing to do, whether that was the most productive thing to do at that particular point in time. But we did it because we thought we were going to, we wanted to act in solidarity with other people, other political movements that were actually waging these struggles.
Well, Leo LeBron sounds like a constructed character. To shout and shoot in the Congress, I'm assuming it's the U.S. Congress that you're talking about. This actually happened, or?
It did actually happen. It did actually happen. Well, you go and Google. Your Wikipedia has much. I mean, I don't know how much of it is accurate, but I think it largely is, because 19, oh God, now, see, I'm really bad sometimes with dates if I haven't prepared, so I'll mental note, I have to prepare the date when Lolita Lebron actually did that, but she did it with 3 other men Rafael Cancel Miranda, perhaps he's better known, I don't know. She was the only woman, but she was actually the political leader of the group. And they did it. They felt like they couldn't find another method. That was how they saw it at the time. Their country was being destroyed, and really in that period, the 1950s and 1960s, after the war, was when the U.S. really kind of took over all the, not directly, but the corporations took over the agriculture and forced, they wanted to industrialize Puerto Rico. They wanted to make Puerto Ricans so they had to buy all their food from the United States, even though it was an agricultural country. So they had something called Operation Bootstrap, and that's, if you're not from the East Coast, then you probably don't know, but half the Puerto Rican population was basically pushed into the United States because they had their livelihood was no longer there. So you think about, obviously political refugees or refugees have been true for so many reasons throughout this country's history, but in this case, 2 million people were forced off their land and ended up in the cities of mainly New York, Chicago, Connecticut, some Florida, but those were the centers of the Puerto Rican community, and that was all in the space of 6-7 years. So they didn't have a means of living anymore, so they had to go somewhere else. Now it's kind of accepted that there are a lot of Puerto Ricans are one of the Latino communities in this country. Out here in California, less so. That's not the dominant Latino group, but groups. But so yeah, that it is, and it's a fascinating history to get into. Which certainly this novel doesn't mean to pretend to be the historical record, but hopefully, I guess one of my goals is to have people think, oh, Puerto Rico, maybe I should learn more about that, especially since they're talking about it and their enormous debt crisis now. How did they get into that situation? Yeah.
This is just a comment on Lolita LeBron.
Uh-huh.
From what I'm remembering,
uh-huh.
Right? I think it was in 1952
uh-huh.
that there was a nonviolent march in Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
Against whatever was going on.
Right.
And basically, there was
a massacre. Right.
People were killed.
Yeah.
Some of our authorities,
right,
in charge of that massacre. And the other thing that I don't remember where my source was.
Mm-hmm.
This late date.
Yeah.
But the information that I had was that they shot
at the ceiling. Yes. Not directly at anyone. Right. Yes. But they all got sentences of life sentences essentially, but so part of the movement that developed in the 1970s was because no one in Puerto Rico or in the United States had done anything since that time around Puerto Rico. So sort of the nationalists, they were called the nationalist prisoners, they were basically just dying or living in prison very invisibly. And there was a resurgence of the movement, and the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, to begin with, really began a campaign to free the nationalist prisoners. And so that, it had a nonviolent solidarity component. They formed something called the Puerto Rican Solidarity Committee, which had chapters all over the country. And then at the same time, this armed group, the FALN, they began armed actions to bring attention to the fact that the nationalists were still in prison, as well as the fact of colonialism and wanting independence. So in 1979, President Carter released the nationalists. So, of course, there are many factors that go into that, but the fact that there was a movement that then spread to Puerto Rico, to the United States, internationally, was very significant. I mean, he would not have released them, obviously, if it wasn't for that movement. And similarly today, Oscar Lopez, there is an international movement, and there have been recent demonstrations within the past year of over 100,000 people in Puerto Rico demanding the release of Oscar Lopez. We don't know about that. I mean, no one is talking about that, but that's pretty huge. It's a pretty huge national sentiment, and it kind of crosses now party lines and how people feel about independence or non-independence. It's a political a feeling that this man has been in prison too long, and he never was even wasn't convicted of any murder. He was just convicted of seditious conspiracy. That was what he was convicted of. So, there are many pieces of this history that have sort of been invisible, and the history itself, I feel, is clandestine. I mean, and that's true of U.S. operations in so many ways, that it operates clandestinely, secretly. It says it's doing one thing, and in reality, it is creating a whole other scenario with these many occupations of countries all around the world, which I know there are many others that you all are much more familiar with.
And it's interesting, it was 1954 actually.
Okay, 54, thank you.
But she was in prison for 25 years.
Right.
And it says here, well, I'm just reading.
Yeah.
But, so I'm not sure exactly how accurate this is.
No.
But it mentions the Navy Vieques protests, which were over the naval bombings of of the islands off the coast, or right off the coast of Puerto Rico, and but she was involved in that up until 2010 when she died at age 9.
Oh, once she was released, yes. She became a stone cold activist after her 25 years. She was part of all the independence movement once she got back to the island.
They were hailed as heroes. Yeah.
Totally. As were the 11 who were released in 1999, which is much more. Well, I was actually involved in both eras, which is really a privilege and so it's pretty amazing when you see people get out of prison especially after 25 plus years. And so even though I know it's hard to say those type of victories are kind of decisive in the global scale of things, they are wonderful. They really feel like amazing victories. So, and they, take enormous work to get people out. So we're really hopeful that Oscar Lopez will also be released within the next period of time.
Do you see, a rise in national concern in the U.S.? Or I think they had a referendum, in fact, that people who wanted to stay connected.
Right, and that's a very complicated, because depending upon who you talk to, the vote had 3 options, and one option was none of the above, and actually, or refused to say, or something like that. And there are some sides of the statistics, or some statistics that claim that the none of the above actually got more votes than the pro-statehood. But, I think the thing is, there is not a consensus in Puerto Rico. There isn't. I mean, and I think very few people would say that. I mean, there's definitely a continuing grouping for independence, just like there's a grouping of people who believe that Marxism is a good tool to understand the world. There's a left, there's a left in this country that continues to operate and struggle for different kinds of a different society. Even though, if you looked at the United States overall, people would say, well, are those people? Does anyone want a different society, or does everyone just care about their latest new app? I mean, so I just think there's difference. There is an independence community, and there are many other communities in Puerto Rico. But one thing that all those communities do agree on now is, the freedom of Oscar. I mean, and that, I'm not exaggerating. That has been a very hard-won unity, but over the years, people have, and he has become a national hero, and that represents something, I think. It represents people's feeling like the U.S. has the power and has abused its power, and by keeping someone like Oscar, who was only struggling for his country's freedom, in prison. So, I think it's a complicated question. I can't pretend to speak for all the different strands in Puerto Rico, but I do think that as I said, in terms of the issue of the debt, there are certain other issues. A couple of years ago, there was a huge student strike that lasted several months in Puerto Rico, and they shut down the whole. It was a university level student strike, and they shut down the universities, and their demands were really for the ability for working class students to go to college, to go to the university, because everything has been privatized. They are taking, the tuition. I mean, it's the same story as what's happening here, but, morefold, because, the average salary in Puerto Rico is probably like, way, way, way below the median in this country. So, those kinds of things, and the struggle now against the debt crisis, and the struggle to figure out a solution to the debt crisis that doesn't just mean more austerity for Puerto Ricans, really is re-raising the issues of the economy, and how can it possibly thrive or get to a different place if all of the economic structures that govern it are so colonial.
Is it correct that the official U.S. policy, political prisoners as a category, do not exist in the USA? Cuba,
they have them. We don't have them. Right.
the former Soviet Union.
Right.
Other nations have political prisoners, but the U.S. officially does not have political prisoners.
Well, yes.
It doesn't recognize that, correct?
Yes, they don't recognize that so you take someone like Leonard Peltier, who is a name that, or Mumia Abu-Jamal. Leonard is almost, he's the poster child for political prisoners. He was part of a resistance on Pine Ridge. There's no proof that he killed anyone. But the government will say that he's not a political prisoner because he shot an FBI agent. That's what they will say. That's how they get around it, is that they say everyone has a criminal charge, and therefore they're not political prisoners. Now, the ironic thing with Puerto Rico is that almost all the Puerto Rican prisoners were only convicted of seditious conspiracy, which in fact is the most clear-cut political charge. I mean, what does it mean to be to engage in sedition if it's not political? However, they will say that they have many different, they couldn't prove that any of the people that they arrested were actually involved in the bombings that happened. So they used the seditious conspiracy charge as sort of a catch-all because they had no other proof of any criminal offenses. So you're absolutely right about the political prisoner. Should we
break now and see the clock, and then you can do more reading?
Yes, yeah. I have more to. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.